Welcome to Biocomputation with Dr. Max. Today, I want to talk about AI and the destruction of value that it entails. And I want to make a simple comparison. AI is like diamonds. They're very expensive today, but a commodity tomorrow. In fact, diamonds are just one example that we can compare AI to, and I'm going to go through these. But the ultimate purpose of today's discussion is to evaluate the AI investment and to see whether or not this is ephemeral value being chased. So let us start. Currently, the grid capacity in USA that's servicing AI is approaching 50 gigawatts. Let's assume it's 40 gigawatts. It's probably generous. By comparison, an average individual's brain consumes about 20 watts. This means that the current USA grid is supporting, in terms of power, the equivalent of 20 billion human brains, more than twice the number of people on the planet. In addition, last year, the sales for the entire AI industry, at least the US players, was around 35 billion, while CapEx exceeded 400. OpenAI alone lost over 21 billion last year. The situation this year is going to get much worse. CapEx for hyperscalers is approaching 800 billion, and the revenue could actually dip because of price competition, and also many enterprise users are revolting against massive increases in costs that are being incurred by AI when it's charged by the token. Uber spent its entire AI budget in under 4 months. Starbucks rejected AI because the system could not correctly count and track inventory. To make this investment work, AI would truly need to replace millions of workers. Fortunately, this is not happening. In fact, many CEOs regret firing their employees. This firing has also drained morale from many remaining workers. Meta, in particular, is having serious problems with morale of employees who were forced into stupid AI training jobs. I will go over other major malinvestments that turned out to be fungible and are comparable to AI. But first, let's keep in mind that what could undermine the existing systems. There is competition that I mentioned from pricing, but there's also external competitors like DeepSeek AI and other open source platforms that provide viable alternative to frontier models that's perhaps 95 or higher % capable of performing tasks compared to the frontier models, and they're controlled by a company running a local LLM, so there is no unpredictable explosion of costs associated with external LLMs. Let me go over some more examples before diving yet deeper into AI CapEx. These examples will include aluminum, salt, spices, silver mining, diamonds, China's housing, US weapons, and finally AI CapEx. The first several have been well established, the last few remain to be explained, so I think this will make for an interesting discussion. Let's start with the history of aluminum. It was more precious than gold. In fact, Napoleon III of France famously honored his guests with aluminum cutlery, while lesser guests used common gold. It was a technological disruption by a pair of inventors, Mr. Hall, a young inventor from the United States, and Mr. Hérault from France, essentially independently discovered this electrolysis process in 1886. It's actually quite remarkable. It's a electrolysis in a molten salt in a kind of special clay, which lowers the melting point of aluminum from 2000 to around 900. This has caused the prices to plummet from around the $12 per pound in 1880, when $12 really meant something, to 20 cents by 1930. Now it's only fit for soda cans and foil. The second example is salt. You may be familiar with the expression worth your salt. The Roman salarium comes from that. It was an allowance for Roman soldiers to buy salt. Salt was used by many countries, in fact, nations, to build salt monopolies. There were the Ethiopians, there were the Venetians, there were some people in China who mined salt lakes. Up till 19th century, salt was still heavily taxed and protected as a strategic resource. Industrial Revolution brought geological surveying and steam-powered mining, revealing massive underground salt domes. This, coupled with invention of refrigeration, destroyed salt's primary value proposition, food preservation. As a result, salt shifted, essentially being weight in gold, to a commodity. Today, it's so cheap, we'll literally throw it on the ground to melt ice. Another example is spices, specifically nutmeg, but also cloves and vanilla. During Middle Ages, these spices came exclusively from a small group of islands in Indonesia. The geographical area where those are native is very small. For example, nutmeg grew on tiny Banda Islands in Indonesia, and it was their trouble that Europeans craved it so that they ultimately not only colonized these islands, but sorry to say, the Dutch colonizers wiped out population on these islands and basically replaced them with slaves. The markup of these spices is what was driving this terrible behavior. It was as much as 32,000%. Because of its price, it was considered essentially a cure-all in Europe. It was recommended for plague, for bad skin, anything. The Dutch and the English fought spice wars over the control of these islands, and they were absolutely brutal to each other's merchants. It was a French spice pirate, Pierre Pauvre, who smuggled seedlings and planted them on French colonies. It resulted in a broken monopoly. The cultivation spread globally, and the people on these islands could breathe again. Now, nutmeg is worth 99 cents per ounce. What's interesting is how these natural resources, what kind of impact they had on the local population. In most of those cases, natural resources that could be mined out of the ground were mined at the expense of the population. This is a very important distinction, and I'll come back to it in the future videos. Silver discovery by the Spanish in the New World also caused unintended effects. They discovered the mountain of silver at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and flooded themselves with so much silver it caused a long-running price revolution. Specifically in Spain, it caused terrible problems with lack of native investment, with increase of prices, with, dramatic price inflation. This has also caused the devaluation of the metal itself, and that actually caused the collapse of silver being used as a store of value, because it was essentially, this discovery was undermining how rare the element was. Another example from which I started is diamonds. De Beers have monopolized diamonds in South Africa and created a very high price expectation. They ran this campaign of a diamond is forever and inherently a rare heirloom in the United States. In fact, diamonds were considered less precious than many colored stones, such as emeralds. But this has inverted due to their massive campaign. However, lab-grown production has scaled exponentially, especially in India and China. And between 2015 and 2025, the natural diamond market shrunk by a third in terms of dollar value because of this overproduction. And this specifically has cannibalized the key bridal market for De Beers. They tried to nip this problem in the bud with creating a kind of a Trojan horse called the Lightbox, where they created their own diamonds and tried to market them at what they thought was an aggressive price of $800 per carat, whereas natural diamonds may be at around $4,000 per carat. But the Chinese and Indian producers underpriced them further still, dropping the lower to 500 and below. So De Beers had to basically abandon their strategy, and they pivoted completely to a rarity argument, saying that whereas the initial argument was that diamonds are universally scarce and they would control the flow, now their argument became that synthetic diamonds are costume jewelry, common technology, whereas natural diamonds are finite geological miracles. Now, let me turn to more modern examples where there's perhaps more room to question whether or not these are truly great examples of devaluation. But I believe they are all examples of important malinvestment. Of course, it's a matter of extent. For example, China's housing, they have produced over 65 million homes that are not occupied, resulting in trillions of value lost to the real estate and to developers. The real estate prices dropped by something like 22%. There is some 20% vacancy, more than double the normal rates. So this has certainly also contributed to the downturn in this market valuation. And again, many of these trillions of investments sit unused, and it's unclear if they will ever be used because China's population has already peaked. Another very relevant example is US investment into its military industrial complex. It has invested trillions of dollars in global hegemony and to support its geopolitical objectives. And this, of course, on one hand, props up the dollar as a reserve currency. On the other hand, it undermines it for our debt. In early 2025, NATO Secretary Mark Rutte has observed that Russia, which has a military budget around 150 billion, produces more than 4 times the amount of heavy artillery shells compared with the entirety of NATO, which has a budget over 10 times more, 1.5 trillion. And of course, all of these heavy shells are being used in the war in Ukraine. The rate of production is important. Again, 10 times more budget for NATO, less than 1/4 of production. So clearly, US invests in extremely expensive weapons, and it has not received strategic capability to defeat opponents like Russia or Iran, which rely on cheap drone technology. So US continues to suffer prolonged and ultimately embarrassing defeats at the hands of Iran and Russia. To put it simply, our weapons are not cost effective. Trillions spent on US military were wasted. According to Professor Ted Postel from MIT, who has deep expertise in this field, PAC-3 Patriot missiles have about 5% hit rate against the mix of target they faced in Iran and Russia. Indeed, in many videos, we can see entire salvos being expanded to no avail. A Russian general mocked these missiles, saying that the Patriot missile cannot protect anything, it cannot even defend itself. In Kuwait and Bahrain, cheap Iranian drones took out billion-dollar radar domes. So the true value of the weapons US produces is probably literally around 5% of its cost effectiveness, meaning some 95% of the investment is wasted. And since World War II, the United States has spent around 50 trillion in today's dollars on its military. And here's the breakdown. Vast amounts of it after supposedly we became the dominant hegemon after the collapse of USSR. Now, let me come back to the main subject of this discussion, the malinvestment by hyperscalers and big tech in AI, and the coming destruction of value. As I mentioned, the revenues of all of these are well under 50 billion per year, in fact, around 35. OpenAI alone lost 25 billion last year, and it's expecting to see greater losses, accelerating losses. Unit economics of AI are dismal, completely unlike software as a service or what Google used to do with its searching engine as the breadbasket. In fact, I have created a video a couple of weeks ago describing AI as ant poison of big tech. So to recap, the AI tokens have become an important currency that measures work and productivity, which is not working well. It's impossible to predict the cost in tokens or the effectiveness, ROI, is also essentially right now impossible to measure. So the field lacks hard benefits, but tokens have a well-established price, which is blowing up the budgets of many companies. As I mentioned, Uber managed to spend its entire annual budget in under 4 months. My prediction is the token price is going to continue to collapse, not only from competition between developers. There could be a price war between Anthropic and OpenAI. They are considering having a price deathmatch, but there's also a reduced demand. Meta is stepping away from developing its own models and is planning to sell capacity. XAI, part of SpaceX, is also lending its spare data center capacity rather than developing its losing Grok model. So I expect the AI is going to simply run out of other people's money, like socialism. This is entirely supported by VCs right now. Neither the individual market nor enterprise is going to support the 10x increase in costs that would be required to sustain AI tokens. So there's vast overspending, and you can see some numbers. Much of this overspending, around $250 billion, has been on chips, which amortize very quickly. In fact, the field is trying to lie to itself that the chips will last 6 or so years, whereas really they last 3 at most. So AI is bankrupting itself out of, because of FOMO. There is more permanent value out there. It has to do with healthcare. So let me finish with the words that I've explained recently about how the Republic should be restored. Res publica restuciende est. Please like, join, and share.